Hello, and welcome to our training on income documentation and evaluation and rent calculation. My name is Ebony Farrell. I am a compliance coordinator with Strategies to End Homelessness. Our hope in providing this training virtually is that it will offer a better opportunity for the community to be able to access and attend the training on their own time and with less trouble. Today we will discuss what HUD considers to be income and when it must be documented and evaluated, which differs depending on the program type. We will also discuss HUD income documentation requirements and some common errors we see when monitoring income. We will also look at when and how to complete the rent calculation form and some common errors that we see on those too. During this presentation, I'm going to be discussing both federal and community requirements. Federal requirements are cataloged in the Code of Federal Regulations published in the Federal Register. Initially, when I talk about 24 CFR 578.77B4, this and 24 CFR 578.77C2, that it may sound a bit like gibberish, but they are actually very systematically organized, and it is helpful to know how to find them. You can go to www.ecfr.gov and look up the regulations by program. We spend most of our time in 24 CFR, which is HUD. Part 5 is General HUD Requirements and Waivers. Part 576 is ESG. And Part 578 is CoC. Anytime I refer to something with CFR in the name, please remember that it is a federal requirement. HUD defines income in 24 CFR 5.609. Annual income is all amounts received by any family member in a 12-month period that is not specifically excluded in 24 CFR 5.609C, which we will discuss in a few minutes. Annual income is an eligibility criteria for certain programs, such as shelter diversion, ESG-RRH at annual assessment, and HOPWA. It is also the starting point for determining the participant's rental portion in permanent supportive housing and under the current RRH rental determination policy. Income includes the following: gross pay from employment, including overtime and tips, net income from the operation of a business or profession. This type of income is not common for our participants, but if you come across it, you should consult 24 CFR 5.609B2 for more information on determining net income from this source. Income also includes interest, dividends, and other net income from real estate or personal property. This is another type of income that you are not likely to come across. However, if you do, you want to look at 24 CFR 5.609B3 to figure out how to determine net income from property. Also included in income are payments from Social Security, insurance, retirement, and similar benefits and funds. When Medicaid is deducted from Social Security payments, make sure that you use the gross pre-deduction amount. If the head of household or spouse is at least 62 years old or disabled, Medicaid is an income adjustment, which I'll discuss when we get to the rent calculation, but it is not excluded income. Income also includes unemployment, disability, workers' compensation, and severance pay. Income also includes welfare assistance received in the form of cash, payments, vouchers, and other forms of benefits designed to meet a family's ongoing basic needs. Generally, the welfare assistance we see is pretty straightforward, but if a participant receives assistance under TANF and you are unsure whether it counts as income, you should consult 45 CFR 260.31. Please note that 24 CFR 5.609 also specifies how to determine income when a portion of the welfare payment is specifically designated for shelter and utilities, but that is not currently relevant in our community. Also counted as income are alimony, child support, and other periodic and determinable allowances, as well as military pay. 24 CFR 5.609C lists income exclusions, which are types of money received that HUD does not consider to be income. I've included them all on the slides because it is important for anyone who is evaluating participant income to be aware of them all. However, some of them are unlikely to come up in our programs. For example, Nazi-era reparations. I'm going to point out the ones that I put in bold as they are the most common ones we see in our programs. Number 1, if there is a child under 18 in the household who has a job, their employment income should not be included in the calculation of the household's income. But please note that a minor's survivor benefits, or SSI, are to be counted as income. Number 3, lump sum payments such as workers' compensation should also be excluded. Number 4, amounts received specifically for or in reimbursement of the cost of medical expenses for any family member. The special programs in number 8 are forms of excluded income that I have not seen in participant records, although it is possible that a site-based project could choose to provide resident service stipends in the future. Number 9, temporary, non-recurring, or sporadic income, including gifts, should not be counted as income. Stimulus checks are an example of non-recurring income that should not be counted, as are tax refunds. I do want to point out that income received from a temp agency is not automatically excluded just because it is temp work. Some employment through temp agencies can last several months and should be counted as income. Number 11, if there is a full-time student 18 years old or older in the household who is not the head of household or their spouse, only $480 of their annual income is counted. The rest is excluded. Another income exclusion we often see is number 14. Sometimes we see this when a participant qualifies for benefits and receives a lump sum payment for previous months for which they were determined to be eligible. This lump sum should not be counted as income. Just count the recurring monthly amount. This exclusion also applies when a portion of the monthly payment is withheld due to previous overpayment. When this happens, you should count the reduced amount, in other words, the amount that the participant actually receives, as the participant's income. I personally haven't seen evidence of any of these last 3 excluded types of income in participant records, but as I mentioned before, it is important that anyone who is evaluating participant income be aware of all of the income inclusions and exclusions, so I have included them on this slide. How often you need to document participant income depends on the type of program they are in. This is defined in the regulations, HUD HMIS data standards, and community policies. Per the regulations, programs funded with COC leasing and/or operating need to document income at project start date and whenever there is a change in family composition or income that would lower the participant's portion of the rent. Although the regulations don't specifically require these programs to evaluate income annually, the HMIS data standards, which I'll discuss on the next slide, do require it. Rental assistance programs must document income at project start date, annually, and anytime changes are identified. The Rapid Rehousing Rental Determination Policy adds to this requirement and I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. ESG shelter diversion programs are required to document income at project start date and at least every 3 months. ESG RRH programs must evaluate participant income at least once annually as part of a reevaluation of the participant's eligibility. HUD has established HMIS data standards, which are updated periodically. These data standards allow for standardized data collection on homeless individuals and families across systems and apply to all homeless programs, not just housing programs. Income information must be collected and entered into HMIS at project start date, whenever there is a change in the amount or source of income, at annual assessment, and at project exit. This applies to all projects, including supportive services only projects and shelters. Locally, our COC has established policies that add to HUD's income evaluation requirements. The current Rapid Rehousing Rental Determination Policy requires that income be evaluated and documented at housing move-in if the date is more than 30 days after the project start date and at least every 3 calendar months, in addition to the times required by the regulations and HMIS data standards. Agencies may evaluate income more often than every 3 months, provided this is done consistently among all program participants served by the project, and that it also is documented in the agency's written policies and procedures. KEYS diversion and progressive engagement housing programs are required to complete rental determination forms on a bi-monthly basis, and income documentation to support the rental determination is to accompany the form. Therefore, income should also be evaluated and documented on a bi-monthly basis. So now that we've reviewed what income is and when it must be evaluated, let's look at HUD's documentation requirements for participants in housing programs found in 24 CFR 578.103A7. Although HUD does not explicitly require the same documentation for street outreach and shelter, as a community, we need to be evaluating income in the same manner across programs, since it is a performance measure that is reported to HUD and used in large group scoring. According to the regulations, there must be a HUD-specified income evaluation form. HUD never developed and disseminated such a form, so we are not looking for a specific format when we monitor PSH projects, street outreach, or shelter. However, when income documentation requires calculation to determine annual income, as is the case with pay stubs or self-declaration of any hourly pay rate, for example, you need to document how you used the documentation to arrive at the annual income that you recorded. The RRH Rental Determination Policy does require the use of the COC-approved income calculation worksheet. When a participant has pay records from a single income source, you enter the gross pay for each pay record at the top, and the worksheet will automatically average them. Do not enter zeros into empty cells. The formula counts cells with entries, so entering a zero will result in an incorrect average. You enter the resulting average amount in the chart that corresponds to the frequency of pay periods to get the participant's monthly income. If the participant has pay records for 2 or more income sources at the same time, you need to complete separate forms for each income source and add the monthly incomes together. There is no need to complete this form if the participant's only income is a recurring benefit for which you have documentation of the monthly amount, or if the participant has no income. 24 CFR 578.103A7 also sets forth the order of priority for income documentation. Source documents are the preferred form of documentation when the participant has income. This is usually pay stubs or a benefits letter or printout. When source documents are not obtainable, you should document your attempts to obtain them and attempt to get third-party verification. The relevant third party, such as an employer, can provide written verification, or you can record and certify a receipt of oral verification. When you receive third-party verification, you need to ensure that it has all of the information that you need to calculate the participant's income. For example, if an employer verifies that the participant makes $12 an hour, but does not provide the typical number of hours worked, you then don't have enough documented information to calculate the participant's income, and you'll need to attempt to get verification from the employer of the hours worked. If you are unable to obtain source documents or third-party verification, you need to document your attempts to obtain both of these preferred forms of documentation, and then get the participant to self-certify. In the example of the third-party verification that contained incomplete income information, you can also get self-certification to fill in the missing information, provided you document your attempts to obtain clarification from the third-party source first. As with third-party documentation, you should review the income information provided in the self-declaration to ensure that it is sufficient for you to calculate the participant's annual income. If a participant has zero income, you are not required to attempt to obtain source documentation or third-party documentation of their lack of income, as it would be difficult to document that something does not exist. However, in cases where a participant loses income, especially benefits such as SSI or SSDI that are typically long-term if not lifetime, it would be reasonable to attempt to obtain source documentation or third-party documentation of the income loss. You would still need to get a signed zero income affidavit even if you obtain outside documentation of the income loss, and this is because the loss of one income does not necessarily mean that there are no other sources of income. So those are HUD's requirements regarding income. You'll see that I have included on this slide some common errors we see when reviewing income, such as income not being evaluated at the required times, especially with rapid rehousing, which requires more frequent request calculation. We often review records where income documentation is not being collected and evaluated as often as is required. Another common error is when case managers do not use the income evaluation worksheet. We often see biweekly pay being doubled to calculate monthly income. This slightly underestimates their actual monthly income. We also see net income being used instead of gross income. We see income documentation with no evidence that it was used to calculate the participant's monthly income. We also see incomplete documentation of household income, where the project does not document the income or lack of income of additional household members. We also see case notes that conflict with the income documentation, such as a discussion of the participant's job at the same time that the income documentation is a zero income affidavit. We also see reliance on self-certification without any documentation in the file of the attempts made to obtain source documentation or third-party verification. We see third-party verification or self-declaration of income that does not contain sufficient information to calculate monthly income. And we also see outdated source documentation, such as Social Security letters that are several years old. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list of errors, but these are some of the common errors that we do see. Rent and occupancy charges for participants in PSH projects are to be calculated based on the household income. The regulations state that occupancy charges may not exceed, and participant rent must be the higher of 30% of monthly adjusted income, 10% of gross income, or the amount of welfare assistance designated by the Agency for Housing Costs. The third situation is currently not applicable to our community, and it would be rare for 10% of the gross income to be higher than 30% of adjusted income, but the rental determination form that most of our community uses automatically calculates which is higher just in case. Continuums of care are required to develop standards for determining what percentage or amount of rent each rapid rehousing program participant must pay. In November 2018, the Homeless Clearinghouse approved a new policy which required the participant portion of rent for RRH participants to be calculated the same way it is for PSH participants, using the CoC approved form. Projects were allowed to determine whether participants already enrolled in the program would transition to this method or continue to have their rent determined by the previous declining subsidy policy. 2 revisions to the policy have been approved by the Homeless Clearinghouse since then, which, among other changes, required projects to apply this method to all participants, regardless of their intake date. Transitional housing, rapid rehousing joint component projects follow a very similar rental determination policy to regular RRH projects. Key differences for THRRH are that participant rental portions in transitional housing are capped at $200 per month. Participants in transitional housing begin paying the calculated portion of their rent up to the $200 cap starting the first full month in housing, and participants moving from a transitional housing unit to a rapid rehousing unit begin paying the calculated portion of rent starting the 3rd calendar month after housing move-in instead of the 4th. The KEYS program uses a different method of rent calculation, which we will not address in this presentation. In PSH projects, rent calculations must be completed at the same points that income evaluation is required. So that would be initially, also when income decreases if the project is funded with leasing and/or operating. Rent calculations must also be completed anytime income changes in either direction if the project is funded with rental assistance. Also when household composition changes, as well as annually. Most PSH projects use the same Excel rent calculation workbook. Under the current RRH rental determination policy, the CoC-approved rent calculation worksheet must be completed before the participant's 4th month in the assisted unit, as 100% of move-in costs and the first 3 months of rent and utilities must be paid by the project. A new worksheet is also required anytime income changes, when the household composition changes, anytime the participant requests their rental portion to be recalculated, and at least once every 3 calendar months. As with income evaluation, if your agency opts to calculate rent more frequently than every 3 months, this must be done consistently among all participants and must be documented in your written policies and procedures. The rent calculation workbook has 8 tabs, one each for instructions, the income evaluation form that I've already discussed, the resident rent calculation worksheet, the CMHA utility chart, an optional check request worksheet, and the regulations defining annual income, excluded income, and adjusted income. I'll just focus on the rent calculation worksheet. The rent calculation starts with calculation of the participant's gross income. You should enter the household income from all sources. If multiple household members have income, it should all be entered into one worksheet. Once you enter gross income into the top portion, you will then enter income adjustments. Some earlier versions of the worksheet had the elderly disabled allowance automatically included, but that resulted in the allowance inadvertently being included for households that were not eligible, so we removed it. In the current worksheet, none of these adjustments are automatic, so you will need to enter them when appropriate. Enter the number of dependents in the household on line 4, and the worksheet will automatically multiply that number by $480 to calculate the deduction. A dependent is defined as any member of the family except foster children and foster adults other than the family head or spouse who is under 18 years of age or is a person with a disability or is a full-time student. Examples of documentation in the file to support the number of dependents could include intake paperwork listing the household members or a lease listing authorized occupants to the unit. Generally, we would expect any dependent for which the household is receiving an income adjustment to live in the unit more than half the time. This can be tricky in households where the participant gains or loses custody. Typically, if the participant does not have custody at intake, the children would not be counted as dependents until the household gains at least partial custody. Rent should be recalculated as soon as you become aware that the household has gained custody, as this change in family composition will lower their rental portion if they are paying rent. I believe that the Family Homelessness Working Group is developing a policy to establish a community standard for when to recalculate rent if the participant loses custody. In line 6, enter anticipated necessary annual child care costs for a child under the age of 13. In order for child care expenses to be eligible for deduction, there are several requirements. These requirements are listed on the Adjusted Income tab of the workbook. You should review the requirements carefully before including any child care expenses on the rent calculation. Some, but not all of these requirements are: the child must be living in the household, and the care must be necessary to enable a family member to work, seek employment, or further their academic or vocational education. You must also document that there is no adult family member capable of providing care during the hours care is needed. The expenses cannot be paid to a family member living in the unit. The amount of the expense must be reasonable and cannot be reimbursed by an agency or an individual outside the family. There are limits on the amount of child care expenses that can be deducted when they are necessary to enable a family member to work. You should pay close attention to the explanation of these limits on the Adjusted Income tab. The expense for child care that enabled a family member to pursue their education or look for work is not limited. The rest of the deductions apply only if the household is an elderly or disabled family. An elderly or disabled family is any family in which the head or spouse or the sole member is at least 62 years of age or a person with disabilities. If there are no family members who are at least 62 years old or who have a disability, or if the person in the household who is elderly or has a disability is not the head of household or their spouse, then the family does not qualify for any of the following deductions. In line 7, enter any unreimbursed reasonable expenses for attendant care and auxiliary apparatus for a household member who is a person with disabilities that are necessary to enable any member of the family, including the person with the disabilities, to be employed. In line 10, enter the earnings of any family member who is able to work as a result of this attendant care or auxiliary apparatus. The spreadsheet will make sure that the deduction does not exceed this amount. In line 12, enter the anticipated annual total medical expenses for the household. Insurance premiums, including the annual amount of Medicaid withheld from Social Security payments, should be included here. Elderly or disabled participants may not be aware that their unreimbursed medical expenses are eligible for deduction. It is important to ask questions and obtain documentation to ensure that they are receiving the deductions for which they are eligible. Some examples of eligible expenses other than insurance premiums that are eligible medical expenses if not reimbursed by another source, are alcoholism and drug treatment, transportation between treatment and home, and prescription medication. Non-prescription medicines may only be included when they are recommended in writing by a licensed medical practitioner as treatment for a specific medical condition that has been diagnosed by a physician or other healthcare provider licensed to make the diagnosis. Remember to enter the annual amount, not the monthly amount, for all medical expenses that you are including. The deductions for attendant care, auxiliary apparatus, and medical expenses only kick in when their sum exceeds 3% of the household's annual income. So it is possible that you will include deductions and the participant's rent will not be affected. In line 14, enter $400 if the household is an elderly or disabled family. If the tenant is responsible for any utilities, you will enter them next. To do this, consult the current chart of housing allowances for tenant-furnished utilities and other services. CMHA publishes the utility chart for Hamilton County. If the unit is located in a different county, you will need to use the chart from the PHA that serves that county. CMHA updates their chart on an annual basis, usually near the end of the calendar year. The Compliance Department at Strategies keeps an eye out and emails the updated chart to agencies when it is available, and also ensures that it gets updated in Rentellect. The chart is also included as a tab in the Excel workbook, but keep in mind that the workbook doesn't update automatically. So if you are using a workbook from a previous year, the utility chart will be outdated. Some agencies prefer to get the utility allowance from a Rentellect report, which is fine as long as you make sure that Rentellect is using the utility chart from the correct year. The spreadsheet will automatically calculate the participant's portion of the rent and any utility allowance based on the information you have entered. If the participant pays no utilities, line 20 is their rental portion. If they do pay some utilities, they are responsible for paying the amount in line 22. There will only be a utility reimbursement due to the utility company on behalf of the participant if their rental portion is zero. In that case, the project must pay the amount in line 23 directly to the utility company, regardless of the amount of the actual bill. At the bottom of the worksheet, you should enter the month that the rental determination takes effect. The RRH rental determination policy allows a form to be used for up to 3 consecutive months if income has not changed. So RRH projects should also enter the months for which it may be reused in the space provided. As with any form that has a signature and date line, the appropriate individual, which in this case would be the participant and agency staff member completing the form, should sign and date it. Electronic signatures are acceptable. If for some reason you do not obtain signatures, the reason should be noted. This slide lists some common errors that we see when reviewing rent calculation forms. Sometimes income is entered incorrectly, or there is no documentation to support the amount entered on the form. Every rent calculation form must have documentation to support the amounts entered. If the participant provides new income documentation on the day you are providing them with their rent calculation, you will need to void the original form and recalculate their rent with the new income information. Another common error we see is that sometimes there is documentation in the participant record that is inconsistent with the number of dependents on the rent calculation. For example, case notes indicating that the participant does not have custody of their children, but the children are included on the rent calculation. Another error we see is rent calculations for elderly or disabled families where the $400 allowance has not been entered. Some PSH households qualify for the program because of a dependent's disability. and those households should not get the allowance. However, in most cases, the head of household or spouse in a PSH program has a disability, so the household should get this allowance. It is also possible for a household where the head of household or spouse is at least 62 years old or has a disability to score into rapid rehousing. And then probably the most common area where we see errors in rent calculation is in utilities. Often there are inconsistencies in the documentation as far as which utilities are the participant's responsibility, as well as what fuel type is used for heating, cooking, and water heating. Also, sometimes the monthly gas fee is not included when participants pay for gas, heating, cooking, or water heating. We also see rent calculations where the utility allowance is based on an outdated utility chart. These regulations and documentation requirements are complicated. There are a lot of little details to pay attention to, and it can be quite frustrating. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions in the future. Thank you for your time.